So, thriving in today's fast-paced world of change and disruption requires innovation. Inside Outside Innovation is the podcast that explores the ins and outs of innovation with raw stories, real insights, and practical advice from the best and brightest in the world of startups and innovation. Each week, we'll bring you the latest ideas in lean startup, design thinking, corporate venture capital, and more. Now, let's get started.
So this week, we sat down with Ken Durand with the Atlanta Idea Factory as part of Ericsson's innovation model and innovation hub, and the way that they take new projects and put it through the rigor and roll. And so we sat down with Ken, and he's had some really interesting things to talk about. Everything from culture and getting the right person on the bus to how you identify those types of people and what type of practices you put around it.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting interview because he specifically gets into some of the traits to look for when you're looking for those entrepreneurs or people to put on the teams. And some of them are quite surprising, especially when you think about the number of people that they look at where they finally narrow it down to the few people that they might put onto a team. And that's a big company like Ericsson with hundreds of thousands of employees.
I think he also does a good job of setting innovation in context and talking about how a lot of what they do in their labs, it really is Horizon 3 type of innovation. So you're working and dealing with a series of unknowns. You're not dealing with just your optimization of your existing business, but how do you really innovate at the leading edges in different markets and different areas that you're not typically accustomed to working in.
All right, let's get into your interview, Brian.
So how did you get started with the particular group? Did you kind of raise your hand, or were you volunteered, or what kind of was the impetus to say, hey, let's focus on this as a key area within Ericsson?
Ericsson is a very, very interesting company, and we're a very invention-driven culture. I meet with people from Fortune 500 companies from all over the world at different places from time to time. And normally what I hear people say is they'll come in and they'll say, one of the things we need to do in our company is figure out how to generate new ideas. Ericsson does not have that problem at all. We are an idea-driven company. In fact, if we say we want to do an issue-driven innovation, we put up an opportunity, we'll get hundreds of ideas. And it becomes not so much a problem of the ideas themselves, but how do you sort through them and figure out which ones should you do? So we've had to put in place a lot of kind of evaluation type efforts in order to figure out which ideas we should pursue and execute against so that we don't, and that's where Lean Startup really came in, is that we couldn't afford to do them all. And we don't want to do them all the old big budget, big company way, because we can't afford to do that either. So this Lean program helps us then go through these ideas much more quickly and sort out the ones that don't need to be pursued through that whole fast failure type approach and find the things that we really should be pursuing. Because our culture is pretty innovation and invention driven, the opportunity to do these sorts of things is not necessarily terribly difficult. But the culture in and of itself is a difficult culture to operate within. And we find this in a lot of companies that I talk to, and that we're just we're very risk averse, and we don't really care for failing. And one of the things that we began to understand that, and this kind of completely revamped our program about 18 months ago, was we began to really understand that it's not so much about the ideas themselves, it's about the teams that you put around them. And that the vast majority of the people that work in a giant corporation are the wrong people to work on entrepreneurial efforts. And in fact, being here in New York City for the Lean Labs event, that's what I'm here to talk about, is the most important thing we've learned in the last 12 months is that you have to put the right people with the right thinking styles against projects.
So talk a little bit about what is a right person to take on these innovation efforts.
So one of the things that's been really interesting is I rediscovered something about a year ago. There was some work done back in 2007, 2008 out at the University of Virginia by a brilliant research professor there named Sarah Sarasvathy. And she had done the original work on this thing called effectual thinking, which is all about the dominant thinking style of individuals being effectual versus causal. And what she found through her research is that the vast majority of entrepreneurial people, successful entrepreneurs, I'm talking about people who had sold their companies or divested it out at $250 million or more, very, very successful companies, were totally dominated by effectual thinking skills. Now, I had seen that work back in the late 2000s and looked at it and thought, yeah, it's very interesting, but what do I do with that information? So what, right? All of a sudden, as we began to do more and more of these lean projects and began to look at the success and failure, I began to realize, wait a minute, when you combine together lean startup with the effectual thinking skills, if we find the right people, we find the explorers in our midst inside the company and apply them against these lean projects, we've now got a marriage of skills that actually leads us closer to success. Here's the thing that I tell people all the time inside of Ericsson. I am very much locked into this idea of innovation horizons, things being close to your core, out at the transformational edge, markets that don't exist. And our teams work very much in the Horizon 3 environment, in the markets that don't exist. You probably have heard that term before. Horizon 3, in and of itself, is not predictable. It has unknowable outcomes. Therefore, if you're working on ideas with unknowable outcomes, all ideas are equal at day one. And it doesn't really matter which idea you pursue because the outcomes are all unknowable. Therefore, if you're going to pursue them, the team is more important than the idea.
Very similar in the startup realm. The team matters more than the idea half the time.
That's exactly right. But one of the things that startups have an advantage of is that people don't go work for a 15-person company unless they already have that mentality. Inside of a company like Ericsson, that mentality is not present in the vast majority of people, nor should it be, by the way, because we have to execute on that $40 billion amount that we have to hit every year. So, it becomes kind of an interesting dynamic.
So did you find a pattern of job titles or individuals, or how do you actually go through the assessment process to understand if they're a right fit?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Now, what I'm going to tell you here is all kind of conjecture at this moment because we're developing this. This is something that really has hit us brand new over the last 6 months to go in and look at this. But we found there's really 3 things that we find that are important. And there may be 4 things or 5 things, but we haven't found the other 2 yet, okay? So just the 3 we know about right now, okay? All right, so number 1 is, do people have the behaviors of entrepreneurs? Are they action-oriented? Do they have a bias towards accomplishing something? So one of the first things we do is through either self-assessment or management and peer assessment, we learn whether or not somebody has this bias towards action. Do they have certain behaviors that they take? And we've got this huge list of things we look at, and then we look for people. Maybe they've displayed X or Y or Z, and that helps us narrow down the people we want to look at. So that may take 1,000 people to 100 people.
So are you actively looking at your cast of characters and saying, okay, here's some potential people we want to further evaluate? Or are people raising their hand and say, we want to be part of this?
That's the plan. It's a little bit of both right now, right? So that's kind of leg 1 of the stool. Leg 2 is their thinking style, right? Do they have a mature thinking style? Is it dominated by either effectual or causal thinking? What are the things that we're looking for there? And there are scientifically validated tools that we can use and do assessments of people. So once we've narrowed that group, let's just say from 1,000 to 100, then 100 we can look at the assessment piece of. Then once we get to that, we can narrow it down to the crossover people, that maybe that 10 or 15 people out of 1,000 that really have both the skill set, the maturity of thinking, the dominant thinking styles, the entrepreneurial pieces. And then maybe it's latent. Maybe it's something that they've kind of got in their background or their history, but they really aren't demonstrating it even today. We don't know. We kind of work through that. And then we have to put them in an ecosystem that can make them successful, incentivize them differently, reward them for failing fast, which is completely different than the average.
So how's it going? What have you learned, and where do you think you're going next?
It's been really interesting. I'd say we've been at this really hard now for 2 years. I would say that we've just this year had our first immensely successful project that's gotten a whole lot of press and a lot of interest from the senior management team across the board. But it took us a while to learn, how do you apply these things within a company like Ericsson in order to find ways to be successful? And it's much different than the standard way of doing business.
And do you think that differs based on the culture, or are there similarities no matter what type of corporation? So if we're some of our audience are probably new folks in corporations trying to figure out how to do this or how to implement it. They're maybe 3, 4, 5 years before or where you guys are at. What are some of the things that you could say, hey, here's some things you should really focus on or do well at the beginning, or things we've learned that could help that new team kind of set out straight?
Yeah, I would say that the most important things I would say that we've learned is that just because a person comes up with an idea doesn't mean they're the right person to actually work on the idea. And that's been something that's been difficult for us, because generally the ability to work on an idea was the reward for being an idea creator. And what we've learned is that may not be the right way to do it if you want them to be successful. Now, if you're just using it as a rewards program, happy, happy, joy, joy, that's fine. But if you're actually wanting to turn it into a business and build some value on top of it, you need to make sure you have the right team applied. So applying the right team to an idea is probably the most fundamental thing that we've learned.
Okay, so Brian, my background is in talent assessment and understanding how you can find the right people doing the right things. So I'm pretty much in love with Ken.
Well, congratulations.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. But seriously, being able to have such a mature understanding of knowing what the right traits are, that is so fundamental to any of these innovation initiatives. There are so many people who dive into doing all the lean startup training and design thinking courses and whatnot with the wrong people. And if you don't start with the right people at the beginning, you are going to have a much, much harder hill to be climbing. I
think it also speaks to the fact that a lot of corporations use innovation as, like you said, a reward system. Like, they don't really care about the innovations. Sometimes it's more like, hey, show us your ideas, and then you'll get a pat on the back for bringing that to the table. Where the companies that are really innovating are the ones that are truly thinking about how do we actually get value out of this, and not just go through the motions, or how do we get the right people working on the right things to create the right value for a corporation moving forward.
Yeah, we didn't mention it at the beginning, but Ken had experience in 3 different startups before he came over into the corporate field. And so that's interesting, especially when you take a step back and you think about who you even have leading your innovation initiatives. He's able to bring at least a different level of maturity in thinking about how you approach innovation, which I think is definitely helping Ericsson out.
Yeah, it's part of the thing that he said about both finding the explorers, but typically the majority of folks that are in your corporation, just the nature of the fact that they've wound up at a corporation, are rarely the type of people that are the true founders and the true startup.
And that's okay.
Exactly.
And it's okay. You don't need everybody to do it. I mean, I was just looking at it recently, that GE and their FastWorks program, like a banner child for lean startup in the corporation, only has about 15% of their employees trained on FastWorks. And so when the vast majority of people in your organization are supposed to be continually finding ways to optimize and execute on the existing business model, you can take the time to find the right people, because it's a smaller amount of people, to focus on those really big Horizon 2, even Horizon 3 innovation initiatives.
Great. Well, that's it for another episode of Inside Outside Innovation. Special thanks to Ken Durand for joining us this week, and thanks to the folks at the Lean Startup Company for connecting us at their Enterprise Summit in New York City a couple months ago. Reach out and let them know how much you appreciate them on Twitter at the Lean Startup, and you can reach us on Twitter at the IO Podcast. Give us some feedback. Let us know your comments. We'd love to hear from you. Also, if you have 30 seconds to spare, we'd love for you to go over to iTunes, leave a review, subscribe there as well. And until next time, go out and innovate.